Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a little trip back in time. But we're not going to see any grand battles or the construction of pyramids. Instead, we're going on a much trickier journey. We're going to try to be a law-minus, abiding citizen in the ancient world. It sounds simple, but the rulebook back then wasn't just about big things like theft or murder. It was about, well, everything. From the color of your clothes to the quality of your tortillas. Honestly, based on some of these rules, you'd probably be in ancient jail before lunchtime on your first day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine, for a moment, that you've stepped out of your modern world and onto a dusty, paved road in a city that existed thousands of years ago. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, livestock, and 100 unfamiliar spices. The sounds are different, to no engine hums, no sirens, just the chatter of a language you don't understand, the braying of a donkey, and the distant clang of a blacksmith hammer. This is your new home, and your first task is simply to not get into trouble. Good luck with that. The first thing you do realize is that law isn't something you can just Google. There's no neatly printed book of statutes. No friendly police officer to ask for directions or clarification. Law here is a living, breathing, and often confusing thing. It's a mixture of age minus old tradition, the word of the local guides, and whatever the most powerful person in the city decided was a good idea that morning. You walk through the marketplace, and you see a merchant and a customer arguing. How do they solve it? There's no small claims court. Maybe they call over a respected elder, or maybe they have to go before a priest who will interpret the flight of a bird to decide who's right. It feels less like a system of justice and more like a high-minus takes guessing game. One of the great breakthroughs in ancient history, a genuine world-minus changing moment, was the idea of actually writing laws down. You've probably heard of the Code of Hammurabi. It's a massive slab of black stone, taller than a person, covered in intricate text. For the first time, in a very public and prominent way, a king declared, "These are the rules, for everyone to see." It established things like the famous eye for an eye principle, but it also covered contract law, family disputes, and property rights. Standing before such an object, you do feel a sense of order in the chaos. It represents an attempt to make justice consistent and predictable. But here's a strange little detail. Even with these magnificent law codes, the legal process was nothing like it is today. In many of these societies, there were no lawyers. The very concept of a professional legal advocate who would argue your case for you didn't exist yet. If you were accused of a crime, you had to stand before the judges and defend yourself. You had to be your own detective, your own spokesperson, and your own emotional support. Imagine trying to argue a complex land dispute against a wealthy, well-spoken nobleman who knows the judges personally. The odds were rarely in your favor. In some places, like ancient Athens, you could hire a professional speechwriter to craft a brilliant defense for you, but you still had to memorize and deliver it yourself, pretending the words were your own. This leads to a fascinating point that historians still argue about today. What was the real purpose of these grand, publicly displayed law codes? Were they intended as a practical, day-2-day rulebook for judges to consult in every case? Or were they something else entirely, a form of royal propaganda? Some scholars believe these codes were more about image than practice. They were a king's way of presenting himself to his people and to the gods as a wise and just shepherd, a protector of the weak and a punisher of the wicked. The actual day-2-day justice in the villages might have still relied on old customs, completely ignoring the king's fancy new style. The debate continues, but it makes you look at that big slab of rock in a new light. Is it a tool for justice? Or the world's first and most elaborate billboard advertisement for a king's brand? As you walk on, trying to keep your head down, you start to notice more subtle rules. The unwritten ones. You see how people bow, who they make eye contact with, and who they avoid. The social hierarchy is a law unto itself. A misplaced word, an inappropriate gesture, wearing a certain type of fabric that's reserved for the elite. Any of these could land you in more trouble than breaking an actual written law. You're not just learning a legal system, you're learning a complex and dangerous dance. And as you watch the setting sun cast long shadows down the narrow alleyways, you begin to notice how people's clothing seems to say so much. Some colors, some fabrics, seem to carry an invisible weight, a warning, and some colors, you're beginning to suspect, are best left untouched. That untouched color you were sensing? Let's just say it's purple, but not just any purple. Not the pale lavender of a common flower or the deep violet of a sunset. We're talking about a specific, vibrant, almost electric shade of purple. In the world you've just stepped into, ancient Rome, this color is more valuable than gold. It's the color of power itself, and wearing it without permission is a crime that could get you into a world of trouble. As you wander the crowded streets of Rome, navigating the flow of people in their simple, off-minus weight to gas, you might catch a glimpse of it. A senator, perhaps, with a single, proud stripe of this purple running down the edge of his toga. It marks him as a man of status. But then, you might see a general, celebrating a great victory in a chariot, draped entirely in a toga of solid, shimmering purple. This is the ultimate status symbol. This is Tyrian purple. Why all the fuss over a color? Well, you couldn't just mix some berries and vinegar to make this shade. Tyrian purple was derived from the mucus of a sea snail, the murex, and not just one or two snails. To dye the trim on a single toga, you'd need thousands of them. To create a full, solid minus colored garment, you'd need tens of thousands. The process was disgusting and incredibly labor minus intensive. Entire coastal towns were dedicated to harvesting these snails, crushing their shells, and letting the glands ferment in the sun. The stench was legendary, a foul, fishy odor that clung to everything for miles. The color of the gods came from the smell of decay. Because of this insane difficulty, the dye was astronomically expensive. It was a luxury beyond luxuries, and the emperors quickly realized its power. They passed what are known as some Uri laws, rules designed to curb extravagance and reinforce the social hierarchy. Under emperors like Nero, the laws became draconian. Only the emperor himself could wear the finest Tyrian purple. If you were caught wearing it, the penalties ranged from having your property confiscated to receiving a death sentence. Imagine that. The fashion police, but with lethal force. You see a beautiful bolt of purple cloth in a shady market stall, and you have to remind yourself that wrapping it around your shoulders is the equivalent of treason. This obsession with purple leads to a rather odd little fact about Roman high society. While we imagine them looking pristine and majestic, anyone wearing a brand minus new purple garment would have carried a faint, lingering fishy smell with them. It was the smell of wealth. It's a bit like someone wearing an overwhelmingly strong and expensive perfume today. It announces their presence and their spending power before they even say a word. Historians and archaeologists have found evidence of these massive dyeing sites, with mountains of discarded murex shells still piled up after 2,000 years, a testament to this ancient, smelly industry. Of course, this raises a question that historians still debate: how effectively were these laws actually enforced? Rome was a massive empire, while an ordinary citizen wouldn't dare parade down the forum in a purple cloak. What about a wealthy merchant in a distant province like Syria or Gaul? Did they secretly wear purple minus trimmed tunics at their private dinner parties? Was there a thriving black market for second minus rate purple dyes that tried to imitate the real thing? Some scholars argue that these laws were more about the statement take constant, visible reminder of the emperor's ultimate authority than about meticulous D-2-day enforcement across the entire empire. Others believe that informants on rivals would have eagerly reported any illegal fashion choices to the authorities, making it a very real risk for anyone who dared to overdress. You quickly learned that it wasn't just about purple. The whole Roman wardrobe was a legal minefield. The number and width of the purple stripes on your toga signified your exact rank in the senatorial or equestrian class. Certain types of shoes were reserved for patricians. Wearing trousers, the preferred garment of the barbarian Gauls and Germans, was initially seen as un-Roman and was even legally banned for a time within the city. Your clothes weren't a form of self-expression. They were your uniform, a legally mandated billboard advertising your place in the rigid social pyramid. You don't just get dressed in the morning. You put on your legal identity. It's a world of strict, top-down control, where the government's authority reaches right into your closet. But as you process this, you realize that not all ancient societies were the same. Power and control took many forms, while Rome used fines, confiscation, and the threat of force to make its citizens fall in line. Other places were a bit more creative. You begin to wonder about other great cities, like Athens. How did they convince their people to participate in public life? Surely it wasn't all just serious rules and regulations. As it turns out, some cities used far stranger, and frankly, stickier, methods to ensure everyone did their part. That stickier method you were imagining wasn't tar and feathers, but it wasn't far off. Let's leave the rigid, top-down world of Rome, with its silent, intimidating displays of power, and travel to a place that was noisy, chaotic, and brilliantly argumentative, ancient Athens. You find yourself in the Agora, the central marketplace. It's less of a uniform, marble plaza and more of a sprawling, dusty, sun-drenched hub of activity. Here, you don't just see commerce. You hear philosophy being debated on street corners, poets reciting their latest works, and politicians trying to win over crowds with passionate speeches. It feels freer, more alive, but you're about to learn that even in the birthplace of democracy, civic duty could be enforced in some very strange ways. The heart of Athenian democracy was the assembly. The ecclesia, where any adult male citizen was expected to show up to vote on laws, declare war, and ostracize unpopular leaders. It was direct democracy in action. But there was a problem. For the assembly's decisions to be valid, they needed a quorum, a minimum of 6 citizens present on the meeting hill, known as the PNYX. Now, think about it. It's a hot day. You could be selling your olives in the market, finishing a pottery commission, or just enjoying a cool drink with friends. Are you really going to trek up a big hill to listen to hours of political speeches? Many Athenians felt the same way, preferring to linger in the Agora. So, how did the state get its citizens to do their duty? This is where the rope comes in. Suddenly, you notice a commotion at one end of the Agora. A group of officials, often public slaves known as Scythian archers, are unfurling a very long rope. They dip it into a bucket of wet, reed powder likely ochre. Then, holding it taut between them, they begin to advance through the marketplace. Panic ensues. People start scrambling, not away from the officials, but towards the path leading up to the PNYX. The officials are using the red-stained rope like a human cattle drive, sweeping it across the open space, trying to herd the loitering citizens towards the assembly. If that rope touches you, it leaves a bright red stain on your clean, white tunic. Getting marked by the red rope wasn't just an embarrassing fashion faux pas. It was a public mark of shame. You were a slacker, a shirker of your civic responsibility, and it likely came with a fine, meaning your reluctance to participate would cost you money. It's a bizarre and comical image the great thinkers and citizens of Athens, fathers of democracy, scattering like pigeons to avoid getting painted by a sticky raid route. It's one of the earliest and strangest examples of the state finding a physical, almost playful, way to enforce participation. Here's a curious little detail that adds a layer of irony to the whole affair. The men tasked with this job, the Scythian archers, were not Athenian citizens. They were slaves owned by the state, foreigners who were bought to serve as a rudimentary police force. They had no right to vote, no voice in the assembly. So you have a situation where non-minus citizens are literally forcing the citizens, their masters, to go and exercise the very democratic rights that they themselves are denied. It's a paradox that reveals the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of Athenian society. Now, academic circles are still buzzing with questions about this practice. Just how was the punishment carried out? Was the fine deducted automatically from some public register? Or did the shaming effect of walking around with a giant red smudge on your back do most of the work? Some historians argue that this was a relatively short-lived experiment, and that the Athenians soon found a much more effective way to boost attendance, paying people to show up. They offered a small fee for attending the assembly, turning civic duty into a paid gig, which proved far more popular than the threat of the red rope. Whether the rope was a serious to love the state or a slightly desperate temporary measure is still debated. This Athenian method offers a fascinating contrast to the Roman laws we just saw. Roman law was often about prohibition. You shall not wear this. It was about maintaining a rigid social order from the top down. This Athenian tactic was about compulsion. You must participate. It reflects a society where the health of the state depended not just on people obeying, but on them actively taking part. But this idea of compelling people, of forcing them to engage, has a darker side. What happens when it's not just your attendance that's being judged, but your very thoughts? In this same city of Athens, a man would soon be put on trial, not for what he did, but for the ideas he shared and the questions he asked. In that same Athenian agora, as you eat carefully avoiding the red rope, you keep seeing him. Yes, not much to look at, a stocky man, maybe a bit shabby, with a famously snub nose and bulging eyes. He doesn't seem important. Yes, not selling anything. Yes, not trying to win a political office. Yes, just talking, or rather, asking questions. This is Socrates, and he is the city's self, minus professed gadfly, a stinging insect sent by the gods to wake up the lazy horse that is Athens. And you're about to witness how a legal system can be turned against an idea, and how asking too many questions can become a capital crime. You watch him work. He'll stop a famous general, a man celebrated for his courage on the battlefield. Pardon me, Socrates will begin with a disarming humility. You are a brave man, correct? Everyone says so. The general, flattered, agrees. Wonderful. Socrates continues. Since you are an expert, could you please tell me, what is bravery? And so it begins. An hour later, after a long, winding, and utterly brilliant series of questions from Socrates, the general is stammering, contradicting himself, and has been forced to admit he doesn't really know what bravery is at all. All this in front of a crowd of smirking young men, the wealthy sons of Athens' elite, who follow Socrates around like a rock star, enjoying the spectacle of their elders being intellectually dismantled. This is the corruption of the youth they will accuse him of. He wasn't teaching them to break laws or disrespect their parents. He was teaching them to question everything, to not accept authority at face value. To the powerful men of Athens, who had just been made to look like fools, this was incredibly dangerous. It undermined the foundations of their authority. The second charge was even more nebulous, SCBIA, or empathy. He was accused of not believing in the gods of Athens and introducing new, strange deities. This was a serious accusation in a city where the favor of the gods was believed to directly impact harvests, wars, and the city's very survival. But what law was he actually breaking? The law against empathy was vague, and that was its power. It could be stretched to mean almost anything, from outright atheism to simply having an unconventional philosophical idea. There was no clear definition, no set of rules you could follow to ensure you were being pious enough. It relied entirely on the interpretation of a jury of 500, one of your fellow citizens, the same citizens whose leaders you might have embarrassed in the marketplace just last week. It was a trial not of evidence, but of reputation and popularity. This brings us to the great debate that historians and philosophers have been wrestling with for over 2,000 years. Was the trial of Socrates really about religion and corrupting the youth? Or was it a political assassination disguised as a legal proceeding? You have to remember the context. Athens was in a fragile state. It had recently suffered a humiliating defeat in the Peloponnesian War and endured a brutal, short-lived oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. Some of those tyrants had been associates of Socrates. When democracy was restored, it was jumpy and paranoid. Many scholars argue that Socrates, with his constant questioning of democratic values and his connections to these now-hated figures, was seen as a threat to the stability of the newly restored government. They couldn't try him for his political opinions, so they used the flexible, all-purpose charge of impunity to get rid of him legally. It was a political hit job in holy robes. A strange and telling detail from the trial itself reveals so much about Socrates' character and why he was so infuriating to the establishment. After he was found guilty, the Athenian legal system required him to propose his own counter-penalty. The prosecution had asked for death. A normal person might have suggested exile or a large fine. Socrates, in an act of supreme and sarcastic defiance, proposed that his punishment should be a reward for his service as the city's gadfly. He argued he should be given free meals for life at the Triton Eum, an honor reserved for Olympic champions and public benefactors. The jury was not amused. Their vote for the death penalty was even larger than their initial vote for his guilt. He was sentenced to die by drinking a cup of poison hemlock. Even then, he had a chance to escape. His wealthy friends bribed the jailers, but he refused to flee, arguing that he had lived his whole life under the laws of Athens, and he would not disrespect them in the end, even when they were being used unjustly against him. So you see, a law doesn't have to be silly to be used in a bizarre way. A perfectly serious law, in the hands of a fearful and vengeful public, can become a tool to silence inconvenient truths. From the abstract crime of dangerous thoughts, our journey now takes us to a place where the law was concerned with something far more solid, something you could see and touch. Let's travel to a much older world, where the consequences of your work, if done poorly, were brutally, terrifyingly clear. You leave behind the Athenian court, with its echoing arguments about philosophy and piety, and travel further back in time, to a different river valley, under a hotter sun. You are now standing in the heart of Mesopotamia, in the legendary city of Babylon. The air is dry and dusty, and the dominant color is the beige of sun-baked mud brick, towering over the sprawling 1-2- houses is the colossal ziggurat, a stepped pyramid reaching for the heavens. This is a city built from the earth itself, a metropolis of clay and ambition, and in this city, the king, Hammurabi, has carved his laws onto a pillar of black stone for all to see. We mentioned this code earlier as a triumph of legal clarity. Now, you're about to see just how terrifyingly clear it could be, especially if your chosen profession was construction. Imagine you're a builder. It's a respectable, essential job in a growing city like Babylon. A wealthy merchant hires you to build him a new, larger home for his family. You gather your workers. You source your bricks and timber, and you get to work. Months later, the job is done. You're repaid, you shake hands, and you move on to the next project. But a year later, during a seasonal flood, the foundation shifts, the walls crack, the roof gives way, and the house you built collapses in a cloud of dust, and the merchant who owned it is killed inside. Under Hammurabi's code, The consequence for you is not a lawsuit, a fine, or the loss of your license. The consequence is death. Law 229 states it with chilling simplicity: if a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls in and kills its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. There is no room for interpretation, no discussion of unforeseen circumstances or soil erosion. The house failed, the owner died, so you must die. But it gets even more specific and more brutal. This is the law of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, in its most literal form. The next law on the slab, Law 230, addresses a different, but equally tragic, outcome if it kills the son of the owner. Then the son of that builder shall be put to death. Let that sink in. The state will come to your home, take your innocent son, and execute him to pay for the death of another man's son. It's a form of justice that is completely alien to our modern sensibilities. It's not about punishing the guilty party. It's about restoring a grim, cosmic balance, a son for a son. Of course, the code reveals a lot about the rigid social hierarchy of Babylon. What if the collapsed house kills a slave of the owner? In that case, the law is different. The builder doesn't forfeit his life, or his son's. Instead, Law 231 says he must simply provide the owner with a replacement slave of equal value. A life is not a life. Its value is tied directly to social status, and if the collapse only destroys property, the builder must rebuild the house at his own expense and replace any of the owner's goods that were lost. This intricate system of liability shows a society deeply concerned with order, property, and class. This leads to a question that archaeologists and historians still puzzle over. Did these incredibly harsh laws actually lead to better, safer buildings in Babylon? When excavating the ruins of these ancient cities, can we see evidence of superior craftsmanship, a standard of construction that stands out from other cultures without such laws? Some scholars argue, yes, that such a terrifying deterrent must have created a culture of extreme diligence and accountability among builders. You would double-minus check every brick, every support beam, if you knew your life, or your child's life, was on the line. But other historians propose a different theory. They suggest that such extreme laws might have had a chilling effect, discouraging builders from taking on ambitious projects or trying new techniques. It may have made the entire profession so fraught with peril that it was hard to find people willing to do the work. It's a classic debate. Does extreme punishment foster perfection, or does it foster fear and stagnation? The Babylonian builder's law was about the quality of a complex, expensive, man-made product. A house. Failure to meet the standard had the ultimate consequence. But what happens when you apply that same logic, that same demand for quality to something far more common, far more everyday? What if the product wasn't a house, but a piece of food? Our journey takes us now across an ocean and forward in time, to a bustling, vibrant empire in the heart of Mesoamerica. There, in the Aztec world, we're going to find out why making a bad tortilla wasn't just poor cooking. It was a crime. Let's leave the dusty plains of Mesopotamia and fly across the centuries and the sea. You now find yourself in a city unlike any you've seen before. It's built on an island in the middle of a vast, shimmering lake, connected to the mainland by long, elegant causeways. This is Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire. The air is clear and cool, and instead of streets, you see a network of canals teeming with canoes carrying flowers, food, and people. Towering temple-minus pyramids dominate the skyline, painted in brilliant shades of red and blue. The market of Tlatelolco, a district of the city, is a sensory explosion. The smell of chocolate and chili fills the air, alongside the vibrant colors of tropical bird feathers, the gleam of polished obsidian, and the chatter of thousands of people speaking Nahuatl. It is one of the largest and most orderly cities in the world, and that order extends to everything, right down to your lunch. You're hungry, So, you head to the food section of the market. You see vendors selling all sorts of things: roasted grasshoppers, rich stews, frothy cacao drinks. But the foundation of every meal, the literal staff of life here, is the tortilla. It's more than just food. It's a sacred gift from the gods. The Aztec deity, Santotiel, was the god of maize corn, and the entire cycle of planting, harvesting, and preparing it was steeped in religious significance. So when you buy a stack of warm tortillas, you're not just buying a product, you're participating in a sacred cultural practice. This is why quality control was not left to chance. As you approach a vendor, you notice someone watching them closely, an official, a market inspector. These officials roamed the great market of Tlatelolco, and one of their specific jobs was to ensure the integrity of the food supply. And they had very specific rules about tortillas. The Florentine Codex, a remarkable encyclopedia of Aztec life compiled by a Spanish friar named Bernardino de Sahagun with the help of Aztec elders, gives us an incredible window into this. It describes, in detail, what made a bad tortilla seller. According to the Codex, a dishonest vendor would try to pass off stale, weak-old tortillas as fresh. They would make them carelessly, so they were folded over, misshapen, or dirty. They might try to use old, sour, or improperly processed corn dough, known as masa. But the most specific crime, the one that really shows you their attention to detail, was selling tortillas that were made thin, like a spider's web. This was considered a serious deception. A good tortilla had to have substance. It needed to be hearty and nourishing. To sell one that was transparent and flimsy was to cheat the buyer and, in a way, to disrespect the sacred maize itself. What was the punishment? The market inspectors had the authority to mete it out right there on the spot. If a vendor was caught selling these substandard, wet-thin tortillas or any other poor-quality food, the officials would publicly shame them. They would berate them, hold up the offending product for all to see, and then, often, they would destroy the rest of the vendor's stock. It was a combination of financial penalty and public humiliation. In a society that prized honor and reputation, being shamed in the middle of the bustling market was a powerful deterrent. Historians are still fascinated by the level of organization in the Aztec marketplace. Was this system of tortilla police a widespread practice throughout the empire? Or was it something unique to the massive, highly regulated market of the capital? Sahagun's work is an incredible source, but it focuses primarily on life in Tenochtitlan. It's debated whether a small village market would have had the same formal system of inspectors, or if they relied more on community pressure and reputation to ensure quality. Some argue the Aztec state was so centralized and powerful that these regulations were likely standardized across their domain, while others believe that, like many things, enforcement would have varied greatly from place to place. This obsession with the quality of a simple food staple reveals something fundamental about the Aztec worldview. It wasn't just about consumer protection. It was about a belief in order, or Talmudic. They believed that everything had a proper place and a proper way of being done, from the grandest religious ceremony down to the patting of a corn cake. A poorly made tortilla wasn't just a bad product. It was a small tear in the fabric of that cosmic order. It was a sign of laziness and deceit, two qualities the Aztecs despised. It's a powerful reminder that for some societies, the most mundane daily activities are woven into the grandest philosophical and religious beliefs. And speaking of beliefs, our next stop takes us to a civilization where the line between the human and animal worlds was so thin that harming one specific creature was considered a crime more heinous than murder. You leave the orderly, high-altitude world of the Aztecs and float down into the fertile crescent of North Africa. The air grows warmer, heavier, scented with river mud, papyrus reeds, and incense. You are in the kingdom of ancient Egypt, a civilization utterly dominated by two forces, the life giving Nile River and an intricate pantheon of gods who walk among mortals in animal form. Here, The line between the sacred and the mundane is almost non-existent. The ibis, the falcon, the crocodile all are seen as living vessels for divine spirits. That one creature, a small, elegant predator that you might have curled up on your own bed, holds a status so high that to harm it is to invite a fate worse than you can imagine. We're talking about the cat. As you wander through a bustling Egyptian town near the Nile Delta, you see them everywhere. They're not just feral strays. They are cherished residents. They lounge in the sun-drenched doorways of homes. They patrol the massive granaries, and they are given scraps of food by passers-by with a reverence you find startling. This isn't just because they're cute. To the Egyptians, the cat was the ultimate protector. In a society built entirely on grain, a creature that efficiently hunted the mice, rats, and snakes that could destroy a year's harvest was a living miracle. They were the guardians of the food supply, the silent heroes of the economy. This practical importance was reflected in their religion. The goddess Bastet, one of the most beloved deities, was often depicted as a woman with the head of a cat. She was a goddess of the home, of fertility, of joy, and also a fierce protector of the king. To honor Bastet, you honored her earthly children. Killing a cat in ancient Egypt was not just illegal. It was considered an act of profound sacrilege, and the law was absolute. The punishment was death. It didn't matter if it was intentional or accidental. There was no trial, no appeal, no I'm sorry. It just ran out in front of my chariot. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, visiting Egypt in the 1st century BCE, witnessed this firsthand and wrote about it with utter astonishment. He tells a story of a Roman official, a member of a diplomatic envoy. At this time, Rome was the rising superpower, and the Egyptians were terrified of offending them. This Roman, through sheer carelessness, accidentally killed a cat. The crowd immediately gathered. High-ranking Egyptian officials and guards rushed to the scene, not to arrest the mob, but to try and save the Roman, pleading with the people and stressing the terrible diplomatic consequences of harming him. Their pleas were useless. The crowd's religious fury completely overwhelmed their fear of Rome. They seized the man and tore him limb from limb. The law was not just a line in a scroll, it was a deeply ingrained, explosive conviction in the soul of the people. This veneration for cats led to some customs that are, to us, deeply strange. When a household cat died of natural causes, the entire family would go into a profound state of mourning, and to show their grief, they would shave off their eyebrows. They would only let them grow back once the mourning period was over. It was a visible, public signal of their loss, but it didn't end there. The deceased cat was not simply buried in the garden. It was given the honor of mummification. Archaeologists have discovered vast cat cemeteries, most famously at a place called Bubastis, the center of Bastet's cult. They haven't just found a few dozen, or even a few hundred. They found hundreds of thousands of mummified cats, each one carefully wrapped in linen, sometimes with intricately painted masks. They were buried with tiny bowls of milk and mummified mice to sustain them in the afterlife. This, however, brings up a debate that Egyptologists still grapple with. As the cult of Bastet grew in the later periods of Egyptian history, it seems to have become commercialized. Was the incredible number of mummified cats found at these sites purely a result of beloved pets dying? Or was something else going on? Some evidence suggests that vast cat-minus breeding operations sprung up near the temples. Pilgrims would come to the temple and, instead of a simple prayer, they would purchase a cat mummy to present as a votive offering to the goddess. X-rays of these mummies have revealed that many of the cats were quite young, often killed deliberately, usually by strangulation, or a sharp blow to the head for this very purpose. This creates a strange paradox of society that would kill a person for accidentally harming a cat, also supported an industry that bred and killed them by the thousands as religious products. How these two realities coexisted is a point of ongoing scholarly discussion. The law in Egypt revolved around a physical act, the harming of a sacred animal. The response was visceral and immediate, but our journey now takes us north, out of the African sun and into the cold, windswept fjords of Scandinavia. Here, you'll meet a people for whom physical toughness was paramount, but where the lore recognized that the deepest wounds could be inflicted not with an axe, but with words. You're about to find out how, in the world of the Vikings, a well-crafted insult could be a crime worthy of a duel to the death. You drift away from the warm sands of Egypt, leaving the scent of incense and the watchful eyes of cat-headed gods behind. A cold wind begins to blow, carrying the salty spray of a northern sea. You find yourself in a long, smoky hall, built from dark, heavy timber. A fire pit in the center casts flickering shadows on the walls, where shields and axes hang. This is the world of the Norsemen, the Vikings. It's a society that values strength, courage, and a fierce, almost reckless sense of personal honor. Here, a man's reputation is his most valuable possession, more precious than his ship or his sword. And while an axe could end your life, you're about to learn that a poem could destroy your soul. In this warrior society, law and order were dispensed from a grand palace. Instead, disputes were settled at a regional assembly called a thing. Once a year, free men from all over the area would gather in an open field to trade, make alliances, and, most importantly, settle legal disputes. It was part town hall meeting, part courtroom. Here, a man who felt he had been wronged could bring his case before his peers. But the wrongs they considered weren't just about stolen sheep or broken contracts. They were deeply concerned with insults. But there was a second, more direct option: the home game, a formal duel. If your honor was questioned, you could challenge your accuser to fight, usually on a small island or a marked -off piece of land. It was a ritualized battle with specific rules. Winning the home game didn't just prove you were the better fighter. In the Viking worldview, it proved the gods were on your side, and that your honor was, in fact, intact. It was justice by combat. Imagine that a legal system where the final appeal is a fight to the death over a nasty poem. The Viking legal system was obsessed with protecting a person's public honor, their external reputation. The harm was in what others thought of you. But what if you encountered a legal system that went deeper? A government that wasn't content to regulate your actions and your reputation, but sought to regulate your internal world, your very feelings? Our journey now takes us to a newly unified empire in the East, a state so focused on order and control that it would dare to tell you how sad you were required to be. We leave the windswept fjords of the north and travel east, across the vast steppes of Asia, until we arrive in all and being forged into a single, colossal empire. You are now in China, during the reign of the first emperor, Tianqi Huang. This is a period of radical, brutal, and breathtaking change. The old, warring feudal states have been crushed, and for the first time, this vast territory is under the control of one central government. The emperor is building the Great Wall, standardizing currency, weights, and measures, and even unifying the writing system. His philosophy is legalism, a school of thought that believes people are inherently selfish and that the only way to maintain order is through a rigid system of strict laws and harsh punishments. In that system, you will discover, extends into the most private and intimate corners of your life, your grief. Imagine a scene in your small, rural village. Your elderly father has just passed away after a long life. It is a time of sadness, of course, but also of quiet reflection and the complex logistics of funeral rites. Your family gathers, neighbors come to pay their respects, and the rituals begin. But as you go about your duties, you are aware of being watched. There are local officials, agents of the state, observing the proceedings, and they aren't just there to offer condolences. They are there to make sure you are performing your grief correctly. Under the Qin dynasty, and codified more explicitly in the dynasties that followed, mourning was not just a personal process. It was a state-regulated duty. Elaborate laws dictated the precise rules of mourning based on your relationship to the deceased. For a father, a son was expected to mourn for 3 years. This wasn't a suggestion. It meant withdrawing from public life, avoiding all forms of entertainment, and wearing coarse, undyed sackcloth. But the law went further. It wasn't just about the external performance. It demanded an authentic display of sorrow. And here we come to the truly strange part. There was, in essence, a crime of insufficient idleness. If an official observed you during the mourning period and judged that you were not acting sad enough, perhaps you were overheard telling a joke, or you failed to cry with sufficient vigor at the funeral, you could be punished. The penalties could be severe, ranging from a beating with a heavy bamboo rod to being forced into hard labor. It was the government acting as the grief police, legislating your emotions. This leads to a bizarre and rather dark little fact about life under such a system. It created a market for professional mourners. If you were not a naturally demonstrative person, or if you were worried your performance of grief wouldn't pass muster with the local magistrate, you could hire people to come to the funeral and wail for you. These were actors, essentially paid to cry, tear at their clothes, and put on a convincing show of uncontrollable sorrow to satisfy the legal requirements. It turns the most profound human emotion into a theatrical performance for the benefit of the state. But why would a government care so deeply about how you mourn? This is a point of ongoing discussion among historians of China. Was this purely about social control, another tool for the authoritarian Qin state to intrude upon the lives of its subjects? Some scholars certainly see it that way. It was a demonstration that no part of life, not even your feelings, was beyond the reach of the emperor. But another, more nuanced interpretation connects it to the philosophy of Confucianism, which, after the fall of the Qin, became the dominant ideology of China. For Confucius, proper mourning and respect for one's ancestors were the bedrock of a stable society. These rites, known as filial piety, were seen as essential for teaching respect for authority. A son who properly mourned his father would become a citizen who properly respected the emperor. By enforcing the rituals of grief, the state wasn't just policing sadness, it was reinforcing the very foundation of its own hierarchical power structure. The debate centers on whether this was a tool of pure oppression, the legalist view, or a tool for social harmony, the Confucian view. The Qin government's desire for order meant controlling everything: emotions, thoughts, writings. They famously burned books that didn't align with their legalist philosophy. They wanted to eliminate distractions, then channel all the energy of the empire into agriculture and warfare. Anything frivolous or unproductive was seen as a threat. And this wasn't just true in China. As we travel west again, into medieval Europe, we'll find that kings had a very similar view of their subjects' free time. You're about to discover why. For centuries, the simple act of kicking a ball around a field was not just a game, but a forbidden activity. Leaving the highly regulated emotional landscape of ancient China, you find yourself on a muddy, rain-soaked field in medieval England. The air is damp and chilly. In the distance, you can see the stone walls of a small town, and beyond that, the imposing figure of a Norman castle. This is a world defined by feudal obligations, military service, and the constant threat of war. Life is hard, and moments of leisure are few and far between. But as you watch a group of young peasants laughing and chasing an inflated pig's bladder across a field, you realize you are witnessing an activity that is not just unsanctioned, but frequently illegal. This is football, and the kings of England hate it. Starting in the 14th century, a series of English monarchs, from Edward I all the way through the Tudor period, passed laws explicitly banning the game of football. To us, this seems utterly baffling. Why would a king care if his subjects were having fun kicking a ball around? Was it just a case of being a royal killjoy? The reasons were actually deeply practical and rooted in the military needs of the state. The primary law of the land was the king's security. Every able-bodied man in the kingdom was, essentially, part of a national reserve army. The most important military skill for a common man to have was not swordsmanship, which was for knights, but archery. The English longbow was a devastating weapon of war, a medieval machine gun that could rain arrows down on enemy formations. But becoming a proficient longbowman required constant, dedicated practice. You needed to build up immense upper body strength and practice for hours every week, year after year, to be effective. And here was the problem. What were all the young men doing on their days off? They weren't dutifully practicing at the archery butts. They were playing football, and medieval football, or mob football, was not the organized sport you see today. It was a chaotic, violent, and all-minus consuming affair. Entire villages might play against each other, with goals miles apart and virtually no rules. The ball could be anything from a stuffed leather ball to an inflated animal bladder. These games were known for causing riots, property damage, and serious injuries. A royal proclamation from King Edward I in 1363 decried that men were idling in the playing of ball games instead of practicing their archery, which was leading to a decline in national military readiness. So the bans were, first and foremost, a matter of national security. The government needed archers, not midfielders. The laws often specifically stated that on holidays, men should practice with their longbows and arrows, and explicitly forbid football, handball, hockey, and coursing, among other useless games. The punishment for being caught playing could be a fine or even imprisonment. It was a direct clash between the recreational desires of the people and the military demands of the crown. But there's a funny, and very human, little fact buried in these repeated prohibitions. The very fact that kings had to keep banning football over and over again for centuries tells you one thing: nobody was listening. The laws were almost completely ineffective. The game was simply too popular. Local sheriffs and magistrates probably found it impossible, or simply not worth their time, to go around arresting dozens of villagers for kicking a ball. The persistence of the game in the face of royal decrees is a wonderful example of popular culture resisting top-down authority. The people just wanted to play. This leads to a historical point that is still debated: were these laws only about archery? Some social historians argue that there was another layer to the ban. These massive, unruly mob football games were seen by the nobility as a threat to public order. They brought together large groups of lower-class men in a state of high excitement and aggression. This was a potentially volatile mix. A football riot could easily spill over into something more serious. So, the bans might also have been a form of class control, an attempt by the ruling elite to suppress the boisterous, unpredictable, and potentially seditious gatherings of the common folk. The official reason was archery, but the underlying fear might have been rebellion. The English kings tried to stamp out a frivolous pastime to enforce a practical skill. Their laws were about what you did with your body. But what if a ruler decided that the problem wasn't your actions, but a part of your body itself? Our journey now takes us east again, to a rapidly modernizing Russia. Your about to meet us are so obsessed with changing his country's image that he would declare war on a very specific part of his noblemen's faces, their beards. We leave the muddy football fields of England behind and travel eastward, into the vast and wintry expanse of the Russian Empire at the turn of the 18th century. You arrive in a society caught between two worlds. It is a land of ancient, deeply conservative traditions, where the nobility, the boyars, are marked by their long, flowing robes and their equally long, flowing beards. A beard was not just a fashion choice. It was a profound symbol of piety in the Orthodox Christian faith, a sign of manhood and wisdom. But a new Tsar is on the throne, a man of towering height and even more towering ambition. This is Peter the Great, and he has just returned from a grand tour of Western Europe. He is disgusted by what he sees as the backwardness of his own country, and he is determined to drag Russia, kicking and screaming, into the modern era, and his first target is your face. Imagine you are a Russian boyar. You pride yourself on your magnificent beard. It has taken you years to cultivate. It connects you to your ancestors, to your faith, and to your status as a nobleman. One day, you are summoned to a reception at the Tsar's court. As you enter, you see the Tsar himself, Peter, standing there with a sharp razor in his hand. He is personally, physically, grabbing his stunned and horrified courtiers and shearing off their beards with his own hands. There is no debate. There is no choice. This is not a suggestion. It is a shocking, humiliating, and very public act of royal will. Peter had seen the clean minus shaven, tailored look of the Dutch shipbuilders and the French aristocrats, and he saw it as the look of progress. He saw the Russian beard as a symbol of everything he wanted to change old superstitions, resistance to reform, and a clinging to an outdated past. So, he made it law. He decreed that men, especially government officials and noblemen, must shave. To enforce this, he stationed guards at the gates of cities with orders to forcibly shave anyone who tried to enter with a beard. But Peter was also a pragmatist. He knew how deeply ingrained this tradition was, and that some men would rather die than part with their beards. He also knew his government was perpetually short on cash, so he came up with a brilliantly strange and lucrative solution: a beard tax. If you were absolutely determined to keep your facial hair, you could, but you had to pay for the privilege. The tax was tiered based on your social class. A wealthy merchant paid a much higher tax than a common townsman. Peasants were largely exempt, as Peter was more concerned with the image of his court and his cities. Upon paying the tax, you would be issued a special token. This was a small, copper or silver coin that you had to carry with you at all times as proof of payment. It was your beard license. One side of the token showed a beard and mustache and the words "the beard is a superfluous burden." The other side often had the image of the Russian eagle and the inscription, "The tax has been taken." Imagine having to carry a coin that simultaneously grants you a right while insulting you for exercising it. It was a perfect blend of state control, revenue generation, and public shaming. This policy created a fascinating cultural and religious schism, which historians still analyze today. It wasn't just a fashion debate. A powerful faction within the Russian Orthodox Church, known as the Old Believers, saw the beard tax as an attack on God himself. They believed that man was made in God's image, and God had a beard. Therefore, shaving was a heretical act of defiance against the divine plan. To them, paying the tax was like paying for a license to sin. They would rather flee, hide, or face persecution than shave. So the beard tax became a flashpoint in a much larger, ongoing struggle between the modernizing, secularizing power of the Tsar and the deeply traditional, religious soul of the Russian people. Was Peter a visionary modernizer fighting against stubborn superstition, or a tyrant attacking the sacred traditions of his own culture? The answer, even today, depends heavily on your perspective. Peter's law argued a symbol of masculinity. It was about controlling how men presented themselves to the world. But this kind of gender-minus specific regulation was nothing new. Let's travel back in time again, to a place we've been before, but to look at a different kind of law. We're returning to ancient Rome, where, for a time, the state felt it had the right to control not just what women wore, but what they were allowed to drink. You find yourself back on the stone-minus paved streets of Rome, but this time, you're looking at the city, not through the eyes of a senator worrying about the color of his toga, but through the eyes of a Roman matron, a respected wife and mother from a wealthy family. Your life is one of privilege, but also of severe restrictions. Your primary duty is to your family to manage the household, raise virtuous children, and uphold the family as honor. Your world is largely domestic, a sphere of influence that is powerful but private, and within this world, there is a strange and ancient taboo that has been codified into law. You are forbidden from drinking undiluted wine. This wasn't a law passed by a specific emperor or a single decree. It was one of Rome's most ancient and deeply ingrained social rules, dating back to the legendary period of the kings. Long before the Republic, the law was simple and stark. For a woman, particularly a married woman, to drink wine was considered a grave offense, an act of profound moral corruption, and the traditional punishment was as extreme as it was for killing a cat in Egypt death. And who had the authority to carry out this sentence? Not the state, but the woman's own family. Her husband, or if he failed, her father or brothers, had the legal right, and some would argue, the duty to kill her for this transgression. Why such a terrifyingly harsh rule against something so common? The reasoning of the Roman man who wrote about it, like Cato the Elder, reveals a deep-seated anxiety about female autonomy. They equated female wine minus drinking directly with adultery. Their logic was that wine clouds the judgment and dissolves inhibitions. A woman who drank wine, they argued, would inevitably be led down a path of moral depravity and infidelity, thus threatening the very foundation of the Roman family, the certainty of paternity. A husband needed to know that his children were his own, and anything that could possibly compromise his wife's chastity was seen as an existential threat. This fear led to a truly bizarre and uncomfortable custom, the ius culi, or the rite of the kiss. For a Roman man, this wasn't about romance. It was a legal right for a husband and his male relatives to kiss his wife on the mouth each day. The purpose wasn't affection. It was to smell her breath. It was a daily sobriety test. If they detected the scent of wine, she could be brought to justice within the family. It's a chilling example of how the law could institutionalize control over a woman's body, turning an intimate gesture into an act of surveillance. Now, here's a point that historians and classicists are still untangling. How literally and for how long was this death penalty actually enforced? The stories of husbands killing their wives for drinking wine come from the very early, almost mythical, period of Roman history. By the time of the late Republic and the Empire, the era of Caesar, Augustus, and Nero, it seems highly unlikely that men were still executing their wives over a cup of wine. The law likely remained on the books as a relic of an older, more severe time, but its enforcement softened considerably. The social stigma remained, but the punishment probably evolved into divorce, public shaming, or financial penalty rather than death. The debate revolves around this transition. When did the law cease to be a literal threat and become more of a symbolic taboo? A story old men told to scare young women into propriety. Tracing that evolution is difficult. The ban was specifically on strong wine. This created some strange loopholes. Women were generally permitted to drink passum, a very sweet raisin wine that was almost more of a syrup and had a low alcohol content. It was considered a safe, feminine drink. This distinction shows that the Romans weren't necessarily against women consuming any alcohol at all. They were specifically against them consuming the substance that fueled male social life, the strong, undiluted wine of the symposium and the political dinner party. It was about keeping women out of the spaces of male power. This Roman law was about preventing an act drinking that they believed would lead to a future crime. It was a preemptive strike against imagined misbehavior. But what about a society that passed a law against an act that, by its very nature, means the criminal can no longer be punished? Let's explore one of the most paradoxical laws of the ancient world, the crime of taking your own life. We drift away from the Roman household, with its suspicious husbands and hidden wine cups, and into a more abstract, legal territory. You are no longer in one specific time or place, but are exploring a concept that appeared in various forms across the ancient and medieval worlds. It is perhaps the most paradoxical of all personal laws, the prohibition against suicide. You're about to discover why. In many powerful societies, the state believed it had the ultimate say over your life, right down to its very end. Imagine you are a soldier in the Roman army, stationed on a remote frontier. The life is brutal, the discipline is harsh, and the future looks bleak. You contemplate ending your own life to escape the misery, but you hesitate, not just because of fear or religious belief, but because you know that for a soldier to take his own life is considered a crime. It is desertion in its most extreme form. You have sworn an oath to the emperor, and your life is no longer your own. It belongs to the state. If you were to attempt it and fail, you could be executed for the crime of trying to rob the army of its property. This Roman military view is a key to understanding one of the primary reasons for these laws. In many societies, the individual was seen as an asset of the state. Your life had value, not just to you, but to the collective. You were a taxpayer, a potential soldier, a farmer, a mother. To take your own life was to steal that resource from the community. In ancient Athens, for example, a person who took their own life without the permission of the state was seen as having wronged the community. As a punishment, they would be buried in disgrace, away from others, and the hand that committed the act would be cut off and buried separately. It was a post-mortem punishment designed to deter others by showing the shame that would befall their memory and their body. The legal and philosophical reasoning changed and deepened with the rise of Christianity. For early Christian theologians like Augustine, the act was a violation of the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Augustine argued powerfully that this prohibition applied to oneself as much as to others. Life was a gift from God, and only God had the right to decide when it ended. To take your own life was to usurp God's authority, a sin of profound pride. This theological argument became the foundation for centuries of European law, both religious and secular. This led to some incredibly grim and bizarre legal traditions in medieval and early modern Europe. If a person succeeded in taking their own life, the law still demanded its due. The deceased could be put on trial posthumously. If found guilty, they would face a series of punishments. First, their property would be confiscated by the crown, leaving their family destitute. This, of course, acted as a powerful deterrent for anyone with heirs. Second, the body itself was subjected to ritual humiliation. It might be dragged through the streets, hung in chains from a gibbet, or most commonly, buried at a crossroads, with a stake driven through the heart. The crossroads burial was symbolic. It was believed to confuse the ghost of the deceased, preventing it from returning to haunt the living. But were these laws universally applied? This is where historians find a fascinating gap between official law and actual practice. Coroners, juries, and local communities often seem to have looked for ways to avoid this brutal outcome. If a person of good standing took their own life, the jury would often go to great lengths to declare the death an accident or the result of temporary insanity or melancholy. This would spare the family the shame and the financial ruin of having their property confiscated. The law was absolute in theory, but in practice, there was often a compassionate conspiracy to get around it. The debate continues on how much this was driven by genuine sympathy versus the community's desire to keep the deceased's property from being seized by a distant king. The state's claim over the end of your life stands in stark contrast to its views on the beginning of a life together. Marriage and divorce, fundamental human institutions, were also subject to a wild variety of strange laws. Let's return to the noisy, argumentative world of ancient Greece, where you'll find that ending a marriage could be astonishingly simple, but the fallout could be anything but. You step away from the heavy, abstract notion of the state owning your life and death, and back into the sunlit glamour of the Athenian agora. We've been here before, dodging the red rope and listening to Socrates, so the territory is familiar. But now you're looking at the most fundamental of social contracts, marriage. In a world governed by intricate laws of property, citizenship, and piety, you might assume that the rules for creating and dissolving a marriage would be equally complex and bureaucratic. You would be wronged, at least about the dissolving part. Imagine you are an Athenian man. You've been married for several years. For whatever reason it doesn't work. You've fallen in love with someone else. Or you're just tired of the arrangement. You decide you want a divorce. In Athens, the process for you is astonishingly simple. There are no courts to petition, no lawyers to hire, no lengthy waiting periods. All you have to do is make a public declaration. You can literally just say the words, "I divorce you," in front of witnesses. Then, you send your now ex-wife back to the house of her male guardian, usually her father or eldest brother. That's it. The marriage is over. It sounds almost modern in its simplicity, but it was profoundly unequal. Now, imagine you are the wife in that same marriage. You are the one who is unhappy. For you, the path is infinitely more difficult. You cannot simply declare yourself divorced. You must go in person to the office of the Archon, a chief magistrate, and submit a written petition. This required you, a woman whose life was expected to be private and domestic, to undertake a very public and risky journey. Your husband or male relatives could legally use force to physically prevent you from reaching the magistrate's office, blocking you in the street to protect the family honor. The law gave you a path, but society put a dozen obstacles on it. But the real legal genius, the part that controlled everything, wasn't about the act of divorcing itself. It was about the money. This brings us to the crucial and oddly fascinating role of the dowry. When a woman married, her father provided a dowry pro X. This was not a gift to the husband. Legally, it remained the wife's property throughout the marriage. The husband had the right to use it to invest the money, farm the land, or use the property, but he never owned it. Its purpose was to support the wife for her entire life, and upon divorce, regardless of who initiated it or why, the husband was legally obligated to return the dowry in its entirety. This is where the simple act of saying "I divorce you" became incredibly complicated. If you, the husband, couldn't immediately repay the entire dowry, the law was crystal clear. You owed the dowry's principal value plus an astonishing 18% annual interest on the unpaid amount. In an economy where 10-12% was the standard loan rate, 18% was a punitive, crushing debt. Suddenly, the power dynamic shifts. A man might despise his wife, but if her dowry was large and he had invested it poorly, he was financially chained to her. He simply could not afford to divorce her. The dowry acted as a powerful disincentive against men casually discarding their wives. It was the cold, hard math that often held a marriage together, not sentiment. This financial mechanism is at the heart of a major debate among historians of the ancient world. What was the real purpose of the dowry system? The traditional view is that it was a protective measure for women. In a society where women had few other economic rights, the dowry ensured that a divorced or widowed woman would not be left destitute. It was her safety net, forcing her husband to behave responsibly and guaranteeing her father's family wouldn't be suddenly burdened with her return. But a more recent school of thought argues that it was less about protecting the woman and more about protecting the wealth and power of her paternal family. From this perspective, the dowry was a tool for elite families to forge alliances and transfer wealth without losing control of it. The woman was the vessel through which the wealth flowed, but her father Tyrios remained the ultimate guardian of that wealth. By demanding its return upon divorce, he ensured that his family's assets didn't get permanently absorbed by another clan. The 18% interest wasn't just to help the wife. It was a weapon to punish a son minus law who had mismanaged the family's assets. So was the dowry a shield for the woman, or a financial chain linking the fortunes of two powerful men? The answer is likely a bit of both. But it reframes the entire institution from a personal contract to a high-stakes financial negotiation between families. In the Athenian system, both the man and the woman, however unequally, were treated as legal persons with rights and obligations. The law governed their interactions, But what happens when the legal system is so bizarre that it doesn't even limit itself to humans? Our journey now takes a turn into the truly surreal, to a time and place where the defendant in the dock, formally accused of a crime, might not be a person at all. It might be a pig, a swarm of insects, or a field mouse. We drift away from the calculated financial intricacies of Athenian divorce and into a world where faith, and agricultural life blend into something utterly surreal. You find yourself in a small village in medieval Europe, perhaps in France or Switzerland. During the 15th century, life here is precarious. The harvest is everything. A failed crop or loss of livestock doesn't just mean a bad year, it means starvation. In this environment, when disaster strikes, people don't just look for a scientific cause, they look for a culprit, and sometimes that culprit has 4 legs and a snout. You walk past the local church and see a strange procession heading toward the town square, where a makeshift courtroom has been set up. It's a full-blown legal proceeding. There is a judge, a prosecutor, and even a defense attorney. Witnesses are called to give sworn testimony, but the defendant, standing silently in a wooden pen, is a pig. The animal is being formally tried for the crime of murder. It is accused of having wandered into a village home and fatally injuring an infant in its cradle. This was not a joke or a mock trial. These were real, documented historical events across Europe from the 9th to the 19th century. There are hundreds of records of animals being put on trial in both secular and ecclesiastical church courts. The legal thinking was that if an animal committed a crime that a human would be punished for, then to restore cosmic justice, the animal must be subjected to the same legal process. It had to be formally charged, tried, and, if found guilty, sentenced. The sentences were carried out with grim seriousness. A guilty pig would often be publicly hanged or burned at the stake in the town square, sometimes dressed in human clothes for the occasion. The strangeness multiplies when you look at the different types of courts. Individual animals that cause direct harm, like the pig, were usually tried in secular courts. But what about pests? What if your fields are being destroyed by a swarm of locusts? Or your grain stores are being eaten by rats? These were considered crimes against the community, and they fell under the jurisdiction of the church courts. You couldn't exactly arrest 1,000,000 locusts, so the court would hear the case against the field mice or the weevils in absentia. A lawyer would be appointed to defend them, and he would make formal legal arguments. He might argue that the animals, as God's creatures, have a right to sustenance, or that the plague was a punishment from God for the people's own sins, and therefore the animals were merely divine instruments. If the court found the animal pests guilty, it wouldn't sentence them to death. Instead, the judge would issue a formal ecclesiastical order of banishment. The pests would be solemnly commanded, in the name of God and the church, to leave the area by a certain date. If they failed to comply, the ultimate weapon would be deployed: excommunication. The entire species of weevils in that region would be formally cursed and cast out from the community of God's creatures. It's an image that is almost impossible for the modern mind to grasp: a priest standing at the edge of a field, reading a legal document to an army of caterpillars. Historians have been arguing about the why of these trials for centuries. What was actually going on here? One school of thought argues that it was a genuine reflection of the medieval worldview. In a universe where God's law governed everything, there was no firm distinction between man and beast in the moral order. All of creation was subject to the laws of justice. The trials were a way of making sense of tragedy, of finding a guilty party and restoring order to a world that seemed chaotic and unjust. It was a deeply sincere, if utterly strange, attempt to apply human justice to the natural world. But other historians see it differently. They argue the trials were a form of social theater. When a pig killed a child, the community was traumatized. A quick, simple slaughter of the animal might feel like mere vengeance. The elaborate trial, however, served a therapeutic purpose. It was a public ritual that allowed the community to process its horror, reaffirm its own values of justice, and demonstrate that they lived in a controlled, ordered universe where even a pig was accountable for its actions. In the case of the pests, it was a way for the church to demonstrate its power. When the locusts inevitably moved on, the church could claim it was their legal order and excommunication that did the trick, thus reinforcing their authority and importance in the lives of the common people. These trials, both animal and human, often revolved around very specific, tangible harms, but law has also, throughout history, attempted to regulate something much more amorphous: status and appearances. We've seen it with Roman purple, but it goes much further. Let's journey into the world of some PTU laws, where you'll find that the government had a keen interest in exactly what you were serving for dinner. Leading behind the bizarre spectacle of an animal courtroom, you find yourself at a lavish feast. The hall is filled with music, laughter, and the rich aroma of roasted meats and exotic spices. You are in late medieval or early Renaissance Europe, perhaps Florence or Paris. This is a time of burgeoning wealth, where a new merchant class is rising, flush with cash from trade and banking. These newly rich families are eager to show off their success, and the dinner table is their primary stage. But as the servants bring out course after course of incredibly elaborate dishes, you notice a palpable sense of anxiety among the hosts. They are not just worried about whether their guests are enjoying the food, they are worried they might be breaking the law. Welcome to the world of some PTU laws. We touched upon them with Roman purple, but their reach extended far beyond clothing. These were laws designed to regulate consumption and luxury, to enforce the social hierarchy by dictating who could own, wear, or even eat certain things. And your dinner party was a prime target for this kind of legislation. Imagine you are the wife of a wealthy wool merchant. You're planning a wedding feast for your daughter. You want to display your family's prosperity. You plan a grand menu: roasted peacock, pies filled with spiced corn, and a towering sugar sculpture for dessert. But before you can send your shopping list to the market, you have to consult the law books. In many cities and states, there were specific laws limiting the number of courses you could serve at a single meal. A commoner's wedding might be legally limited to 3 courses, while a nobleman could perhaps serve 5. The law might state that only the highest nobility were permitted to serve peacock at their feasts, as its extravagant beauty was considered above your station. That's one pie. Forbidden. Certain spices, like saffron, might be restricted to aristocratic kitchens. The punishments for breaking these laws varied. Typically, it was a hefty fine. The host of the illegal feast would be on the hook, and sometimes even the guests who partook in the forbidden dishes could be penalized. City officials, sometimes called kitchen police, could have the authority to raid a private dinner party if they suspected the laws were being broken. It adds a whole new level of stress to event planning when you have to worry about the authorities bursting in to count your side dishes. So why this obsession with what people were eating? The official reason given by lawmakers was usually moral or religious. They argued that such extravagance was sinful, a sign of pride and gluttony that would anger God and lead to social decay. They claimed they were promoting thrift and virtue among the populace, but the real reason was almost always social anxiety. The old, landed aristocracy saw their status being eroded by the new money of the merchant class. These merchants might not have noble blood, but they had cash, and they were using it to live lives of conspicuous luxury that rivaled, or even surpassed, that of the old families. The Sumpitiyuri laws were a desperate attempt by the traditional elite to draw a clear, visible line between us and them. You may have more money than I do, the laws essentially said, but you are still not allowed to eat the same food, wear the same fabrics, or trim your white dress with the same fur as I am. I am a noble, and you are a commoner, and this law will make sure everyone knows it. It was an effort to make social class an immutable fact, written on the very clothes people wore and the food they consumed. This leads to a fascinating debate that historians of economics and culture still engage in. Were these some PTU laws a genuine break on social mobility and economic growth, or were they a total failure? The evidence largely points to the latter. Like the ban on football in England, these laws were widely ignored. People are endlessly creative when it comes to status symbols. If you ban peacock, they'll find an equally impressive, but legal, way to cook a goose. The laws had to be constantly updated to forbid new trends in fashion and food, creating a cat minus and minus mouse game between the regulators and the newly rich. Some historians even argue the laws had the opposite effect. By officially designating certain goods as exclusive, they made them even more desirable, fueling a black market and encouraging people to find clever ways to flaunt their wealth without technically breaking the law. For example, a law might limit the number of dishes, so a host would serve one dish that was actually an enormous platter containing 10 different kinds of meat. These laws were about assigning value and status to specific goods. But what about a legal system where the values assigned seem completely out of whack with reality? Our journey now takes us back to the ancient world, to an empire where the fine for stealing a beehive was governed by a logic so strange, it still mystifies historians today. You leave the lavish, legally fraught dinner parties of Renaissance Europe and travel back into the deep past, to the rocky, arid highlands of Anatolia, in what is now modern Minus-Day Turkey. You are in the heart of the Hittite Empire, a major Bronze Age power and a rival to the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians. The Hittites were a formidable military force, known for their pioneering use of iron weapons and war chariots. They were also meticulous record minus keepers and lawyers. At their capital, Hat USA, archaeologists have unearthed thousands of clay tablets, including a remarkably detailed law code. And as you begin to decipher its clauses, you find a system of justice that is not based on the brutal life or an illogic of Babylon, but on something else complex, and sometimes utterly baffling, system of fines and compensation. The Hittite legal system was overwhelmingly based on restitution. If you wronged someone, your primary punishment was not death or physical mutilation, but paying them back for the damage you caused. This sounds quite reasonable and modern, but the specific values they assign to things are what make their laws so fashionably strange. The code sets out precise fines for a huge variety of offenses, creating a detailed price list for crime. Let's look at some examples. According to the laws, if you are a free man and you knock out another free man's tooth in a fight, you must pay him 20 shekels of silver, a hefty but understandable fine. But now consider the law regarding bees. If you steal a swarm of bees from a sealed, marked beehive, the fine is only 5 shekels of silver. This immediately seems odd. In an agricultural society, a swarm of bees, a source of precious honey and wax, was an incredibly valuable asset, arguably more so than a single tooth. Why was the fine so low? The weirdness doesn't stop there. The code gets even more specific. If you steal a whole beehive, but the hive is empty, just the clay or wicker structure itself, the fine is 6 shekels. This is the part that makes historians scratch their heads. Stealing an empty, worthless hive incurs a higher fine than stealing a hive full of productive, valuable bees. What could possibly be the logic behind this? This is where the academic debate really heats up, because there is no easy answer. One theory is that there's a translation issue. Perhaps our understanding of the Hittite words for swarm or hive is incomplete, and we're missing some crucial context. Maybe the empty hive was a special, ritually significant object. Another, more compelling theory suggests the laws were designed to reflect the difficulty of the theft. Stealing a live swarm of bees is a difficult, painful, and risky business. Stealing an empty hive is easy. Therefore, the law might have been designed to more harshly punish the lazier, more opportunistic crime. A third theory dives into the concept of property. A swarm of bees, while temporarily in your hive, was seen as somewhat wild, not fully owned. The physical hive itself, however, was a man-made object, a piece of undisputed property. Therefore, stealing the object was a greater offense against the concept of ownership than stealing the semi-wild creatures it contained. None of these theories are fully satisfying, and the case of the expensive empty hive remains one of the great little mysteries of ancient law. The Hittite code is full of these odd valuations. The fine for blinding a free man is 20 shekels, the same as for knocking out his tooth. But if you blind a slave, the fine is only 10 shekels. If a dog bites a man and the man dies, the dog's owner has to pay 20 shekels. If a pig kills someone, the compensation is also specified. It's a legal system that attempts to put a precise silver value on every conceivable harm, from personal injury to agricultural theft, but through a cultural lens of value that is now almost impossible for us to fully penetrate. The Hittites were clearly concerned with agricultural property, as were most ancient societies. Their laws about bees, livestock, and fields were incredibly detailed. This points to a universal concern for all developing civilizations. How do you manage life when thousands of people start living together in one place? Let's move from the specific laws of one empire to a more general problem, the very first rules designed to make city living bearable. You're about to find out what happened when you were caught throwing your garbage in the street in the ancient world. We step away from the specific legal puzzles of the Hittite code and into a more general, and frankly, much smellier environment. You find yourself standing in a narrow, crowded street in a major ancient city. It could be Rome, Athens, or Alexandria. The experience is an assault on the senses. The street is outpaved, turning to mud in the rain and dust in the sun. There are no sidewalks. You are dodging donkeys, carts, and streams of people. And underfoot, the ground is littered with a foul cocktail of household waste, and vegetable peels, animal bones, broken pottery, and worse, there are no garbage trucks, no municipal waste services, and you're about to discover the very first, often desperate, attempts by ancient governments to deal with the problem of trash. In the earliest cities, there was no concept of public sanitation. The system was simple. You had waste. You opened your door or your second-story window, and you threw it into the street. The phrase garde l'eau, from the French garde is l'eau, watch out for the water, which was famously shouted from tenement windows in medieval Edinburgh before a bucket of filth was tossed out, has its roots in this ancient practice. The street was the communal dump. This, obviously, created a nightmare scenario. The streets were disgusting. They stank, and they were breeding grounds for disease. As cities grew larger and more sophisticated, civic leaders began to realize that this was not sustainable. This realization led to some of the world's first urban management regulations. In Athens, for example, they passed a law that was both groundbreaking and slightly absurd. It dictated that waste could not be thrown into the street. Instead, citizens were required to carry their trash to a designated location. The catch? That location was specified as being no less than 1 mile from the city walls. Think about that for a moment. You, an ordinary citizen, are now legally responsible for hauling your family's garbage on a 1-mile trek outside the city every day. There's no pickup service. This created a new, informal economy. Poorer citizens, or slaves, could make a small living as dumpsters, going from house to collect waste and haul it out to the official dumps for a fee. The law didn't create a public service, but it did create a new, and probably very unpleasant, job. In Rome, the problem was even bigger, with a population of over 1 million people at its peak. The city was a marvel of engineering, with aqueducts bringing in fresh water and sewers, like the Great Cloaca Maxima, carrying away wastewater. But there was no equivalent system for solid waste. While wealthy homes might have their own cesspits or private collection arrangements, most people living in the crowded apartment blocks, the insulo, still used the old method, tossing it out the window. Roman law had to adapt. There were specific regulations that allowed you to sue someone if you were injured by falling waste. If you were walking down the street and a pot thrown from a window hit you on the head, you could bring a case against the tenant for damages. The law even accounted for different outcomes. The fine was higher if the victim was a free man than if they were a slave. This leads to a fascinating bit of urban archaeology that historians and sanitation engineers still study. What did they do with all that trash? The official dumps outside the city walls grew into colossal monuments of waste. One of the most famous examples is Monte Testaccio in Rome. It's not a natural hill. It's an artificial mountain made entirely of broken pottery, specifically fragments of amphorae, the large clay jars used to transport olive oil. Over centuries, as millions of these jars were emptied and discarded, they were systematically broken up and stacked to create a hill that today stands over 115 feet high and covers an area of nearly 5 acres. It's a testament to the sheer scale of Roman consumption and the logistical challenge of their waste. The academic debate here centers on enforcement. It's one thing to pass a law saying don't throw trash in the street. It's another thing to police it. In a sprawling, chaotic city, how could you possibly catch everyone? Some scholars believe these laws were only sporadically enforced, perhaps used to make an example of a few people or to settle grudges between neighbors. Others argue that in certain well-regulated cities, like Athens with its market inspectors, enforcement might have been more rigorous. That for most people, the daily reality was likely a negotiation, a dance of trying not to get caught, while also trying not to get hit by your upstairs neighbor's fish heads. These early sanitation laws were about managing the unsightly byproducts of civilization. They were about keeping up appearances, and the idea of maintaining a certain public image was incredibly important to the Romans, not just in their streets, but in their identity. Let's stay in Rome for a moment longer to look at a law that wasn't about what you threw away, but what you wore on your legs. You remain in the bustling, noisy world of ancient Rome, but you're shifting your focus from what's underfoot to what people are wearing. We've already seen how the color of a toga could get you killed, but now you notice something else, or rather, a lack of something else, as you watch senators, soldiers, and citizens go about their business. You see a lot of bare, hairy legs. Even on a cool morning, the men are all in tunics and gas. There are no trousers. This isn't a coincidence or a simple fashion choice. For a significant period of Roman history, wearing trousers or braxiae, as they called them, was not just seen as strange or foreign. It was officially illegal within the city of Rome. The Roman worldview was built on a simple, powerful binary. There was Rome in it as the quality of being Roman, and there was everything else. Everything else was, by definition, barbarian. The toga was the quintessential symbol of Roman identity and citizenship. It was impractical, heavy, and difficult to wear correctly, but that was the point. It signaled that you were a civilized man, a member of an urban, sophisticated society, not someone who needed to ride a horse or trudge through the mud. Trousers, on the other hand, were the garment of the other. They were associated with the Gauls, the Celts, the Germanic tribes, the horseback minus riding. First, minus dwelling peoples of the cold north whom the Romans considered to be savage and uncivilized. For a Roman man to wear trousers was to reject his own identity. It was seen as a sign of effeminacy, decadence, and a disgusting adoption of foreign, barbarian customs. The moralists and poets of the time wrote scathingly about it. To them, a Roman in trousers was as shocking and wrong as a soldier running from a battle. This deep-seated cultural prejudice was eventually codified into law. Emperors like Honorius, in the late 4th century AD, issued decrees explicitly banning the wearing of trousers within the city limits of Rome. If you were caught sporting a pair of pants, you could face punishment, including the loss of your property and permanent exile. This law, however, highlights a huge, evolving contradiction that the Roman Empire could not escape. while the politicians in the city were banning trousers as a symbol of barbarism. The Roman army, the very engine of the empire, was enthusiastically adopting them. As the empire expanded northward into colder, harsher climates like Britain and Germany, the legions quickly discovered that a tunic and a toga are not practical gear for marching through a snowy forest. Soldiers, ever the pragmatists, began wearing tight fitting leather or wool trousers, adopting the barbarian garment out of sheer necessity. You ended up with the bizarre situation where a soldier would be legally required to wear trousers as part of his uniform on the frontier, but if he were to wear that same uniform on leave back in the capital, he would be a criminal. This is where the historical debate gets really interesting. What did this trouser ban really signify? Some historians see it as the last, desperate gasp of a dying cultural ideal. By the late Empire, the lines between Roman and barbarian were blurring completely. Barbarians were serving as generals in the Roman army. The empire was filled with people from conquered lands, and the old, traditional Roman identity was fading. The trouser ban wasn't a confident assertion of Roman superiority. It was a sign of profound insecurity. It was a futile attempt to legislate an identity that was already disappearing. A way for the elite in the capital to pretend they were still different from the barbarians who were, by that point, running most of the empire. Others see it more as a symbolic law, rarely enforced but important for what it said. It was a way for the emperor to signal his commitment to traditional Roman values, even as those values were becoming obsolete. It was political theater, a way to appease the conservative senators in Rome who were alarmed by the barbarization of their society. The average person on the street was probably not getting arrested for their legwear, that the law remained on the books as a statement. Eventually, the law and the cultural bias simply crumbled under the weight of reality, as the Western Roman Empire fell and its territories were taken over by Germanic tribes, like the Goths and the Franks. Trousers won. They were simply a more practical garment. The toga disappeared, and trousers became the standard attire for men across Europe. The barbarian custom had become the norm. The law failed because it tried to fight against the unstoppable tide of cultural exchange and practicality. The Roman law on trousers was about protecting a physical symbol of identity. But what happens when the thing being protected is not physical at all, but intellectual? Our journey now takes us to the misty shores of early medieval Ireland, where a dispute over a book would lead to one of the world's first legal rulings on the concept of a copy. You leave the crumbling grandeur of Rome, with its anxieties about fashion and identity, and travel north, across the sea, to a land of green hills, monasteries, and scholars. You are in 6th century Ireland, a place that, after the fall of Rome, has become a vibrant center of Christian learning and art. In quiet, stone-built monastic scriptoria mess, monks spend their lives painstakingly copying and illuminating sacred texts. Books are incredibly rare and precious. Each one is a work of art, a vessel of knowledge, and an object of immense power. And you are about to witness a legal dispute that revolves not around land or cattle, but around the ownership of an idea. The story, passed down through Irish annals, centers on two prominent holy men. The first is Saint Finian of Movilla, a renowned teacher and the head of a great monastery. He has recently returned from a trip to Rome, and he has brought back with him an exceptionally beautiful and rare copy of the Psalms, known as the Psalter. It is his prized possession. The second man is a younger, fiercely intelligent, and somewhat headstrong monk named Columba, who would later become one of Ireland's most famous saints. Saint Comiso. Columba visits Finian's monastery and is captivated by this beautiful psalter. He asks for permission to make a copy of it for himself. Finian, for reasons that are lost to history, perhaps he was protective of his unique book. Perhaps he just didn't like Columba's attitude, refuses. Undeterred, Columba decides to do it anyway. Every night, he secretly enters Finian's scriptorium and, by the light of a single candle, begins to meticulously copy the entire book, page by page. Legend has it that his hand glowed with the divine light, allowing him to see in the dark. Just as he finishes the last page, Finian discovers the unauthorized duplication. He is furious. He confronts Columba and demands that he hand over the copy. Finian's argument is simple: he owns the original book. Therefore, he owns the copy made from it. Columba refuses. His argument is equally clear: he did the work of copying, and the materials vellum and ink were his to use. Furthermore, he argues, a copy doesn't diminish the original. Finian still has his perfect book, and now, through Columba's labor, another copy exists to spread God's word. It is a fundamental disagreement over the nature of intellectual property, centuries before the concept of copyright would formally exist. Since neither man will back down, the dispute is taken to the highest legal authority in the land, the High King of Ireland, Diarma Mac's bail. The king listens to both sides of the argument. It's a novel case. There is no existing law that covers the ownership of a copy of a book. The king must make a judgment based on traditional Irish law, which is largely concerned with more tangible property, like livestock. After considering the matter, King Diarma issues his famous ruling. He sides with Finian, and he does so with a simple, rustic analogy that every person in his agricultural society would immediately understand. He declares to every cow her gaff, and to every book its copy, Legach bo and a boanin, Legach lieb har liebiator an. It is a brilliant piece of legal reasoning. Just as a calf, the natural offspring of a cow, belongs to the owner of the cow, so too does a copy. The offspring of a book belong to the owner of the original book. He orders Columba to surrender his copy to Finian. Historians and legal scholars are still fascinated by this story. Is it a literal, factual account of a 6th century legal case? Or is it a legendary tale created later to explain the origins of a famous manuscript and a subsequent tribal war? Columba, being of royal blood, did not take the judgment well, and the dispute escalated into a bloody battle. Many scholars believe that, while the details might be embellished, the story reflects a very real and early grappling with the concept of authorship and ownership of information. It shows a legal system being forced to adapt, to take its existing principles about tangible property and apply them to the new and challenging world of ideas. The debate centers on whether this was a true, precedent-setting legal decision, the first copyright case, or simply a memorable story illustrating a common-sense principle. King Diarma, its judgment was a definitive ruling, an attempt to settle a dispute once and for all. But many laws are not about settling disputes. They are about maintaining control. And one of the oldest and most universal tools of social control is telling people when they are, and are not, allowed to be outside. Let's explore the long and often surprising history of the curfew. You step away from the quiet, scholarly world of the Irish monastery and back into the dark, narrow streets of a medieval European city. The sun has set, the wooden shutters on the houses are bolted, and an unnerving silence has fallen, broken only by the distant barking of a dog or the scuttling of rats. Suddenly, you hear the slow, rhythmic tolling of a church bell. This is not a call to prayer. It is a warning. This is the curfew bell, and it signals that you have a very short amount of time to get indoors, or you will be breaking the law. The word curfew itself gives a clue to its origins. It comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, which means cover the fire, in its earliest form. Introduced to England by William the Conqueror in the 11th century, the curfew was a practical fire safety regulation in towns built almost entirely of wooden thatch, with open hearths in every home. The risk of a catastrophic fire was immense. The curfew bell was an order for every household to extinguish or cover their fires for the night to prevent sparks from escaping and setting the town ablaze. It was a simple, logical precaution. But it didn't take long for rulers to realize that this practical tool had a much broader application. A law that forced everyone to be in their homes after dark was an incredibly effective instrument of social control. The streets at night were seen as dangerous, lawless places, the domain of thieves, drunks, and conspirators. By clearing the streets, you could, in theory, dramatically reduce crime. The curfew evolved from a fire safety measure into a public order ordinance. Watchmen would patrol the empty streets, and anyone they found out and about without a legitimate reason and often without carrying a lantern could be arrested, fined, or thrown in the stocks for the night. The curfew also had a clear political and military dimension. For occupying forces like William's Normans in England, the curfew was a powerful tool to suppress dissent among the conquered Anglo-Saxons. It prevented them from gathering secretly at night to plot rebellion. It made it easy to spot anyone moving around suspiciously. The sound of the bell was a nightly reminder of who was in charge. It wasn't just about safety. It was about submission. This is where you find a fascinating split in historical interpretation. Was the curfew primarily a beloved safety measure that citizens welcomed? Or was it a resented symbol of oppression? The answer seems to be both, depending on who you were and when you lived. For a law-abiding merchant, fearful of being robbed on his way home, the curfew might have been a welcome security blanket. The empty streets were safe streets. The watchman was his protector. This view holds that curfews were a practical response to the very real dangers of the pre-industrial city night. But for others, the curfew was a constant irritation or a genuine hardship. What if you were a doctor trying to reach a patient? Or a traveler who arrived at the city gates after they'd been locked for the night? What if you just wanted to visit a friend? The law often made little distinction. From this perspective, the curfew was a blunt instrument that stifled social life and treated all citizens like potential criminals. More pointedly, historians debate how much the curfew was used to enforce class and ethnic divisions. In many towns, the regulations were much more strictly applied to the poor or to specific minority groups, like Jews, who were often confined to their ghettos after dark by law. The curfew, in this light, becomes a tool for enforcing social and racial segregation. A strange little detail of curfew enforcement was the password system. In many fortified towns, the night watch would have a daily or weekly password. If you were a person of high status and had a legitimate reason to be out, you would need to know the password to get past the watch. This, of course, reinforced the social hierarchy. The powerful had the connections to get the password. The commoner did not. It created two sets of rules for the night. The curfew was a law against being in a certain place at a certain time. But what if the law was even more vague? What if you could be arrested not for doing something wrong, but simply for being something undesirable? Let's explore the strange and troubling history of laws against just hanging around. You leave the empty, echoing streets of the medieval city at night and find yourself in the daylight of a different era. You could be in Elizabethan England, colonial America, or any number of societies undergoing rapid social and economic change. You're watching people, but you're noticing the ones who aren't doing anything in particular. They are leaning against a wall, sitting on a public bench, or just ambling down a street with no apparent destination. They are not begging. They are not causing trouble, but they are idle. And in the eyes of the law in many historical periods, their idleness itself was a crime. Welcome to the world of vagrancy laws. These laws made it a crime to be a vagrant, an idler, or a sturdy beggar. But what did that actually mean? The definitions were often incredibly vague and circular. A vagrant was a person with no visible means of support and no fixed home. How did a constable determine this? By finding you wandering around during working hours. Your crime, in essence, was being poor and unemployed in a public space. The origins of these laws in England, particularly after the Black Death in the 14th century, were rooted in economics and control of the labor force. The plague had killed a huge portion of the population, leading to a severe labor shortage. For the first time, peasants and laborers had some leverage. They could leave their traditional feudal manners and travel the country, seeking better wages. The ruling, landowning class was terrified of this. They needed a cheap, stable workforce that would stay put. So, they passed laws like the Statute of Laborers, which fixed wages and made it illegal for an able-bodied man to refuse work if it was offered to him. Vagrancy laws were the enforcement arm of this policy. They were designed to stop people from moving around. If you were found on the road without a letter from your master, you could be arrested, branded, and forced to return to your home parish. The punishments could be shockingly severe. In Tudor England, under laws known as the Bloody Code, a first-time vagrancy offense could get you whipped until you were bloody and sent home. A second offense could mean having part of your ear cut off or being branded on the forehead with the letter V. A third offense could be punishable by death. These weren't laws designed to help the poor. They were designed to terrorize them into staying put and accepting whatever work they could get, at whatever wage was offered. This brings us to one of the most contentious debates among social and economic historians. Were vagrancy laws purely a tool of labor control, a way for the rich to oppress the poor? Or were they also driven by a genuine, if misguided, sense of social anxiety about crime and disorder? The argument for labor control is strong. The laws always became harsher when labor was scarce and landowners needed to suppress wages. But the other side points to the widespread belief at the time that idleness was the root of all sin and crime. In the popular imagination, the wandering vagrant was not just an unemployed worker. He was a potential thief, a con man, a carrier of disease, and a threat to the social order. The respectable, settled citizens of a town genuinely feared the bands of masterless men who roamed the countryside. From this perspective, the harsh laws were an expression of that fear, an attempt to protect the community from what they saw as a dangerous, mobile underclass. A strange, and rather telling, detail is what these laws often classified as vagrancy. The definitions could be incredibly broad. They often included actors, minstrels, fortune-minus stellars, and tinkers, people whose very professions required them to travel. This reveals the deep suspicion that settled agrarian societies had for anyone who didn't have a fixed place in the hierarchy. If you didn't have a master or a trade that tied you to one spot, you were a rogue, an outsider who didn't fit into the neat boxes of their world. The vagrancy laws were a powerful tool because they were so subjective. A constable or a local magistrate had immense discretion. He could arrest someone simply because he didn't like the look of them. There was no need to prove they had committed a specific act of theft or violence. Their status as an idler was the crime. This brings us to a fundamental question of justice. What happens when the law doesn't care about what you did, but only about whether you are guilty? Let's travel to a court where the very method of determining guilt or innocence was left not to evidence, but to fate and divine intervention. We step away from the unsettling vagueness of vagrancy laws and into a legal proceeding that is, by contrast, terrifyingly decisive. You find yourself in a clearing outside a small village in early medieval Europe. A crowd has gathered around a pit of roaring fire. There is a priest, a local lord, and a man who has been accused of a crime, let's say, stealing from the church. But there are no witnesses, and he is not confessed. In a world without forensic science or detective work, how can the court determine his guilt? They are going to ask God to tell them, "You are about to witness a trial by ordeal." This was a very real and legally sanctioned method of justice for centuries. The core belief was simple: God, being just, would not allow an innocent person to suffer. Therefore, if the accused was subjected to a dangerous, painful test, God would intervene with a miracle to protect them, thus proving their innocence. There were several common forms of ordeal. One of the most famous was the ordeal by fire. In one version, the accused would have to carry a piece of red minus hot iron for a set number of paces. In another, They would have to walk blindfolded and barefoot over a path of burning plowshares. The test wasn't whether they got burned. Of course they got burned. The real test came afterwards. Their wounded hand or foot would be bandaged and sealed by the priest. 3 days later, the bandages would be removed in a public ceremony. If the wound was healing cleanly, it was a sign of God's favor they were innocent. If the wound was festering and infected, it was a clear sign of God's judgment they were guilty and would then face the legal punishment for their crime, which could be mutilation or death. Another common method was the ordeal by water. In this version, the accused would be bound and thrown into a river or a deep pool of water that had been blessed by a priest. This is the one that is most often misunderstood. We tend to think of the sink or float test for witches, where floating meant guilty. That was a later, corrupted version. In the original ordeal by water, the logic was the opposite. Since water was a pure element, blessed by God, it would accept the innocent. If you sank, you were innocent and quickly pulled out in theory. If you floated, the pure water was rejecting you because of your sin. Floating meant you were guilty. The logic behind these trials is so alien to us that it's hard to comprehend, but it reveals a worldview completely saturated with faith. Justice was not a human calculation of evidence and probability. It was a divine revelation. The courtroom was not a place for argument, but a stage for a miracle. This is where you find one of the most intense debates among medieval historians. Was trial by ordeal sincere, if brutal, system of justice, or was it a sophisticated charade? One school of thought argues for its sincerity. The people, from the priest to the peasant, genuinely believed that God would intervene. It was an ultimate act of faith, placing the entire justice system in God's hands. But a more cynical, and perhaps more persuasive, argument suggests that the system was heavily rigged. The priest officiating the ordeal had enormous power. Think about the ordeal by fire. Who judged whether the wound was healing cleanly or festering? The priest. It was a subjective call. A priest who believed the accused was innocent could interpret any sign of healing as a miracle. One who was convinced of the man's guilt could see any redness or swelling as a sign of divine condemnation. In the ordeal by water, the ropes could be held in such a way as to make sinking or floating more likely. From this perspective, the ordeal wasn't really a test of the accused. It was a test of the priest's opinion. Cloaked in the language of divine will, it was a way for the authorities to achieve the result they wanted while claiming it was God's judgment. A fascinating detail is how the church itself eventually turned against the practice. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent I made a world-changing decision. He forbade priests from participating in trials by ordeal. He declared that these trials were tempting God, trying to force a miracle, which was a form of blasphemy. Without the clergy to bless the water and consecrate the iron, the entire system lost its theological legitimacy. This single ruling effectively ended trial by ordeal across Europe and forced secular courts to develop new systems of justice based on evidence, testimony, and juries. It was one of the most important legal developments in Western history. Trial by ordeal was a way to force a verdict when there was no evidence. But what happens in a system that does have evidence, but where you, the accused, are not allowed to remain silent in the face of it? Let's look at a world before the right to silence existed. You move on from the dramatic, faith-based spectacle of the ordeal into a more familiar-looking setting, a courtroom. It might be in revolutionary France, or in an English court during the age of religious persecution. There is a judge, a jury, and a prosecutor. It feels more modern, more rational. You, the accused, are standing in the dock. The prosecutor has just finished laying out the case against you, presenting letters, witnesses, and other pieces of evidence. Now, all eyes turn to you, and you are faced with a terrifying legal reality: your silence can be used as proof of your guilt. In many historical legal systems, The concept we now call the right to remain silent simply did not exist. In fact, the opposite was true. The court and the jury expected you to respond to the charges, to defend yourself, to offer an alternative explanation for the evidence presented. To stand silent in the face of an accusation was seen as unnatural. What innocent person wouldn't leap at the chance to declare their innocence and refute the charges? Silence was interpreted not as a legal right, but as a tacit admission of guilt. It was seen as the sullen defiance of a guilty heart that had no honest defense to offer. Imagine the pressure. You are not a lawyer. You are likely uneducated. You are intimidated by the solemnity of the court. The prosecutor is a skilled orator who has just twisted every fact to make you look as guilty as possible. You know that anything you say can be used against you, but now you learn that your silence will also be used against you. It's a legal trap, a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. If you speak, you risk misspeaking, contradicting yourself, or appearing nervous and therefore guilty. If you stay silent, the jury is encouraged to conclude that you have something to hide. This legal principle was particularly powerful in trials concerning heresy or political treason. In the infamous Star Chamber of England, for example, defendants were oft unquestioned under oath. Refusing to answer was not an option. You had to speak, and you had to tell the truth, even if that truth would lead you to the executioner's block. It was a system designed not to discover the truth in a neutral way, but to confirm the state's suspicions and secure a conviction. This brings us to a complex legal and philosophical debate that evolved over centuries. What is the true meaning of silence in a courtroom? For a long time, the prevailing view was that silence in the face of accusation was evidence of guilt. This was based on a common-minded sense, psychological assumption about how innocent people behave. But a new school of thought began to emerge, championed by thinkers of the Enlightenment. They argued that there could be many reasons for a person's silence. They might be terrified. They might be confused. They might be protecting someone else. Or, most importantly, they might believe that the burden of proof should be entirely on the state. The government has accused you of a crime. It is up to the government to prove it, beyond a reasonable doubt, with its own evidence. You, the defendant, should not be required to help them do their job. A fascinating and brutal little corner of English legal history illustrates the extreme lengths the system would go to in order to avoid silence. In the past, for a felony trial to proceed, the defendant had to formally enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, but some defendants would refuse to plead at all. This was called standing mute. Why would they do this? Because if they didn't enter a plea, the trial couldn't happen, and if they weren't tried and convicted, their property couldn't be legally confiscated from their family. It was a way to protect their heirs. The court's response to this was a horrifying procedure called peine forfaite or hardened forceful punishment. The mute defendant would be taken to a cell, stripped, and have a heavy board placed on their chest. Weights would be added, day by day, crushing them until they either entered a plea or died. Many chose to be pressed to death to save their family's inheritance. This barbaric practice was eventually abolished, a recognition that forcing speech was not justice. The eventual establishment of the right to remain silent was a monumental victory for individual liberty. It enshrined the principle that the state must prove its case and that a defendant's mind is their own private territory, which the court cannot force them to reveal. It shifted the balance of power in the courtroom dramatically. We have journeyed through a world of strange and often terrifying laws. We've seen laws about clothing, food, feelings, and even animals. But there's one final question to consider. As we look back at all these bizarre rules, how much do they actually reflect the day minus to minus day reality of the people they governed? Let's take one last step back and think about the great unwritten laws of human society. Here we are, at the end of our long and winding journey through the strange back minus sallies of legal history. We've seen kings ban football and Tsars tax beards. We've watched inspectors scrutinize tortillas and priests excommunicate caterpillars. We've stood in courtrooms where the defendant was a pigant, where silence was a confession. The law, as we've seen it, has been a tool of control, a reflection of deep seated anxieties, and sometimes just plain weird. But now, as you stand back and look at the grand tapestry of these ancient societies, you have to ask one final, crucial question: how much did any of this really matter to the average person on an average day? This is the ultimate challenge for a historian. The laws we've been discussing exist because they were written down. They survived on stone tablets, in medieval manuscripts, and in royal decrees. They are the official story, the way the people in power wanted their society to work. But the day life of a Roman peasant, a Viking farmer, or an Aztec market vendor was rarely recorded with such permanence. The vast majority of human existence has been lived off the books, governed not by formal statutes, but by a much older and more powerful set of rules, custom, tradition, and good old fashioned common sense. Imagine you are that Hittite farmer again. The law code says the fine for stealing an empty beehive is 6 shekels, but your neighbor's son just stole your empty hive. Are you really going to travel for 3 days to the capital, file a formal complaint, and try to bring the case before a royal judge? Or are you going to walk over to your neighbor's house, have a heated argument, and eventually agree that his son will help you fix your fence as compensation? For most people, throughout most of history, justice was local. It was negotiated between families. It was mediated by the village elder who knew everyone involved. The king's law was a distant, abstract thing, reserved for the most serious of crimes or for disputes between powerful people. This brings us to one of the most significant and ongoing debates in legal history: the gulf between law in the books and law in action. How strictly were any of these bizarre laws actually enforced? We've seen hints of this all along our journey. The English kings had to keep banning football because people just kept playing it. Roman moralists complained constantly about luxury, suggesting some PT laws were being widely ignored. A formal law against insufficient grief in China is one thing. Policing the genuine emotions of millions of people is a practical impossibility. It's tempting to think of our ancestors as simple folk who blindly followed every rule laid down by their rulers. But that does them a disservice. They were just as pragmatic, creative, and willing to bend the rules as we are. They understood that there was the official law, and then there was the way things actually worked. They knew which laws were deadly serious, like the Egyptian taboo against harming a cat, and which were more of a suggestion. The law was a powerful force, but it was always a negotiation with human nature. A fascinating piece of evidence for this is the discovery of ancient curse tablets. In places where people felt the official legal system couldn't or wouldn't help them, they took matters into their own hands. They would write a curse against the person who wronged them on a thin sheet of lead, and then nail it to a temple wall or throw it in a sacred spring, calling on the gods to deliver a more personal, supernatural justice. This was a parallel legal system, one based on magic and divine retribution, for people who felt the official channels had failed them. So, as we look back on our journey, we see that these strange laws tell us 2 stories at once. They tell us the story of what worried the powerful: social mobility, religious sympathy, military readiness, and the control of resources. They are a map of elite anxieties, but the very existence of these laws, and the constant need to repeat and enforce them, tells another story. It tells the story of the ordinary people who work constantly pushing the boundaries, carving out their own spaces for joy, commerce, and personal expression, often in direct defiance of the official rules. The silent history of the law is the history of its quiet disobedience. These strange laws are not just monuments to the power of the state. They are monuments to the enduring, resilient, and often rebellious spirit of the people who lived under them. And so, our journey through the strange corridors of ancient law comes to a gentle close. The echoes of the lawmaker's gavel and the debater's voice begin to fade, replaced by a softer, quieter hum. The vivid scenes of Roman streets and Viking halls, of Aztec markets and Egyptian temples, all begin to soften at the edges, their sharp details blurring into the warm, hazy landscape of a dream. You can feel the dust of the ancient roads settling, the light of the tallow candles flickering and dimming, as the weight of all that history becomes light as a feather. The arguments and anxieties of the past no longer concern you. The fear of wearing the wrong color, or serving one too many dishes at a feast, or forgetting the password for the night watch, all of it drifts away on a slow, easy tide. You are floating now, past the stone tablets and the papier scrolls, their rigid lines and strange symbols dissolving into flowing patterns behind your closed eyes. The worries of those ancient lives, once so immediate and real, are now just whispers in a story that has been told. They are distant stars in a vast, dark sky, and you are drifting peacefully through the quiet space between them. There are no more rules to follow, no more judgments to fear. There is only the gentle rhythm of your own breath, pulling you deeper into a place of quiet rest. The story is over, and the night is yours. The end of the article. Good night.